A homeless man finds a lost child. What he does next changes everything. The city groaned under the weight of winter's icy breath. A biting wind swept through the streets, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked asphalt. Beneath the glow of flickering streetlights, the world moved in a blur of indifference. Cars honked, pedestrians hurried, and somewhere in the chaos, a man sat unnoticed against a graffiti-covered wall. Thomas, wrapped in a patchwork of threadbare blankets, clenched, his hands around a battered coffee cup. His fingers were numb, his stomach hollow, but he had grown used to the hunger pangs. The chill, however, was merciless. It seeped through his coat and into his bones, making him shiver uncontrollably. He scanned the crowd passing by, faces blurred by the haze of fatigue and preoccupation. No one looked at him. No one ever did. He was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of their bustling lives. But then, through the fog of apathy, he noticed something unusual. A small figure stood motionless near the intersection. A little girl, no older than 7, clutched a stuffed bear tightly to her chest. Her wide eyes glistened with tears, and her lips quivered as she muttered something under her breath. Thomas frowned. The child was alone. That much was clear, and the way she looked around, her head jerking in frantic motions, told him she was scared. For a moment, he hesitated. His life had taught him to stay invisible, to avoid entanglements, but the sight of her, so fragile, so vulnerable, stirred something deep within him. Against every instinct, Thomas stood, his knees protesting from hours of sitting in the cold. He couldn't ignore her. Not this time. Thomas hadn't always lived this way. Once, he had a home, a family, and a purpose. He had been a teacher, the kind who stayed after class to help struggling students and spent weekends grading papers with meticulous care. He had loved his job, loved the way a child's face lit up when they finally understood a difficult concept. But life has a way of unraveling even the most carefully woven plans. When his mother fell ill, Thomas became her sole caregiver. Medical bills piled up, and he drained his savings trying to keep her comfortable in her final days. After she passed, he found himself alone and financially ruined. Losing his job was the final blow. With no income and mounting debt, Thomas was evicted from his modest apartment. He spent months couch surfing with friends, but eventually, their patience wore thin. With nowhere left to turn, he ended up on the streets. At first, he fought to reclaim his life, applying for jobs and seeking help from shelters. But the rejection letters came one after another, each one a reminder of his diminished worth in society's eyes. Over time, hope faded, and he settled into a routine of survival. Each day was a battle to find food, warmth, and a safe place to sleep. Yet, even in his darkest moments, Thomas held on to a small shred of dignity. He shared what little he had with others in need, offering a kind word or a helping hand whenever he could. But the world rarely returned the favor. On this particular night, he had been counting the coins he'd collected throughout the day, hoping to afford a hot drink. But the sight of the lost girl changed everything. Thomas approached her cautiously, not wanting to frighten her. "Hey there," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Are you okay?" The girl flinched at first, clutching her bear tighter. But when she looked up at him, her fear melted into desperation. "I can't find my mommy," she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city. Thomas crouched to her level, his heart aching at the sight of her tear-streaked face. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Working offline." "Emily," she replied, sniffling. "Emily," he repeated, offering a small smile. "I'm Thomas. I'm going to help you find your mom, okay? But I need you to trust me." Her tiny hand slipped into his, and Thomas felt a spark of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He stood and scanned the crowd, hoping to spot a frantic-looking parent. But no one seemed to be searching for a child. "Where did you last see her?" he asked as they began walking. By the park, Emily said, her voice trembling. We were getting ice cream. And then I couldn't find her. Thomas nodded, his mind racing. The park was several blocks away, and it was already late. He knew the safest option was to take her to the police station. But the thought of walking into a station filled him with unease. Would they believe his story? Or would they assume he had sinister intentions? As they made their way through the city, Thomas noticed the stares. People whispered and pointed, their expressions a mix of suspicion and judgment. One man even stopped to mutter, "What's a guy like you doing with a kid?" Thomas ignored him, but the words stung. He kept his focus on Emily, who clung to him as though he were her only lifeline. When they finally reached the police station, Thomas hesitated outside the door. Doubt swirled in his mind. What if they didn't believe him? What if they accused him of something terrible? But as he looked down at Emily, who gazed up at him with trusting eyes, he knew he had no choice. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth of the station a stark contrast to the cold night. An officer at the front desk looked up, her eyes narrowing as they landed on Thomas. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone wary. "This little girl is lost," Thomas explained. "I found her near the intersection. She says she got separated from her mom by the park." The officer's gaze softened as she looked at Emily, who nodded and clung to her bear. She motioned for another officer to take Emily to a side room, where she was offered a blanket and a cup of hot cocoa. Thomas stood awkwardly by the desk, unsure of what to do next. He was about to turn and leave when a voice called out behind him. "Thomas!" He turned to see a woman in uniform, her face a mix of shock and recognition. "It's me, Officer Martinez," she said, stepping closer. "Don't you remember? You used to tutor my brother after school." Thomas blinked, struggling to place her. Then it clicked. She had been a teenager back then, full of dreams of joining the police force. "I always wondered what happened to you," she said softly, her eyes scanning his weathered face and threadbare clothes. "You were the kindest person I knew." Thomas looked away, ashamed. "Life happened," he muttered. Martinez placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done a good thing tonight," she said. "You gave that little girl hope when she needed it most." Moments later, the door burst open and a woman rushed inside, her face pale with panic. "Emily!" she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. Emily's face lit up and she ran into her mother's arms. They clung to each other, sobbing, as Thomas watched from a distance. The mother turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for bringing her back to me." Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a burden or an outcast, but as someone who mattered. Officer Martinez approached, him again, her expression thoughtful. "Thomas," she said, "we have programs that could help you. Housing, job assistance. It's not too late to turn things around." Her words stirred something in him. For so long, he had believed that his life was beyond saving. But now, for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. In the weeks that followed, Thomas's life took a turn he never thought possible. With the help of the police station's outreach programs, he found a small apartment and a job as a teaching assistant at a local community center. Working with children reignited his passion for education, and he found joy in mentoring kids who reminded him of his former students. News of his act of kindness spread through the community, inspiring others to look beyond appearances and extend compassion to those in need. Thomas became a symbol of resilience and redemption, proof that even the smallest acts of kindness can lead to profound change. And though his journey was far from over, Thomas knew one thing for certain. He was no longer invisible. He mattered, and that made all the difference. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Echo Tales for more inspiring stories of hope, kindness, and redemption. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, one act of kindness can light the way. Together, let's make the world a better place, one story at a time.